Hello, and welcome to A Shadow of Divine Perfection, Art of the Italian Renaissance and Baroque. My name is Dr. Katie Clark, and on behalf of the patrons of the arts and the Vatican museums, thank you so much for joining us. Today's lecture, Caravaggio, the Cursed Painter, is the sixth lecture of this 7-part series. If you'd like to rewatch any part of today's talk or see any previous lectures from this or other series, you can always visit californiapatrons.org/lecture-series, as well as our YouTube or Facebook pages. This lecture series is underwritten and presented by the California and Northwest chapters of the Patrons. As a nonprofit organization, the Patrons of the Arts work to preserve, protect, and restore the vast and unique treasures housed in the Vatican museums in Rome. While the patrons support the restoration and conservation work of the entire Vatican museums, chapters and individuals often undertake special restoration projects as well, like the Northwest chapter's recent restoration of the famous Perseus with the Head of Medusa by Antonio Canova. Housed in the octagonal court of the Pio Clementino Museum, Canova's work was inspired by, and today still stands near, one of the most outstanding works of classical sculpture to survive, the Apollo Belvedere. This statue was part of a collection that Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere held in his palace in Rome, and when he was elected to the papacy as Pope Julius II, he brought that collection with him to the Vatican, where it has remained since at least 1508. The Belvedere Apollo was part of an outstanding collection of classical statuary that della Rovere had assembled, and it was considered toward the end of the 18th century to be the pinnacle of Greek art. So it's not surprising that Canova, one of the greatest classically inspired sculptors of his day, drew inspiration from it. Canova's Perseus with the Head of Medusa, which dates to 1800 to 1801, also resides in the Pio Clementino Museum's octagonal court and was brought to the museums by Pope Pius VII in the early 19th century. Depicting the Greek mythological hero Perseus, son of Zeus and Danae, Canova has sculpted him here with the helmet of Pluto, the winged sandals of Mercury, and the diamond sword given to him by Vulcan, gifts that enabled him to defeat Medusa, whose head he holds. During restoration, underwritten by the Pacific Northwest chapter of the Patrons, the statue was methodically and entirely documented with a 3D laser scanner. It also went a close stratigraphic analysis, a thorough surface cleaning, the removal and replacement of old iron nails, and was placed on a new pedestal, a faithful recreation of the original, which had deteriorated by that point. This is just one example of the kind of work that the patrons support on an ongoing basis. You can learn more about becoming a patron and see the projects that are currently underway by visiting our website at californiapatrons.org. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter for today's lecture, Dr. Rocky Ruggiero. Rocky is a professor of art and architectural history. A lecturer for various American universities in Florence, he has also appeared in a number of TV documentaries about the Italian Renaissance. After living in Florence for nearly 20 years, Rocky now divides his time between the US and Italy, offering specialized lectures on art and architectural history. In Italy, Rocky leads private excursions and adult programs in Florence, Rome, Venice, Siena, and Northern Italy. And as I tell you every week, because it's the absolute truth, he is one of our great favorites anytime we visit Rome with the patrons. And so please give a warm welcome to Dr. Rocky Ruggiero.
Grazie, Katie. Grazie mille for another fantastic introduction, the sixth great introduction in a row. So you're on a roll, and thank you again. And were we in Rome right now, splitting a big plate of spaghetti alla carbonara? Wouldn't be so bad, but I guess the best we can do is talk about the great artist Caravaggio. In Rome, of course, is the city that best showcases his work. A tip of the hat to the Northwest chapter for their restoration of that great statue by Canova, the Perseus with the head of Medusa. In fact, you may know that the sculptor Antonio Canova has recently been in the news because of that tragic accident that took place in Turin, Italy, where a tourist tried to take a photograph sitting on top of a large plaster model of one of his other famous statues, the Paolina Bonaparte Borghese, and actually broke a couple of toes off. So just to reiterate again how vital the role organizations like the Patrons of the Arts in the Vatican museums are, because that credo, it is to preserve, to protect, and to restore. To preserve, to protect, and to restore. Because what you do, aside from just contributing directly to the restoration of the artwork, is also just raising a general sense of awareness. And the word I like to use is reverence towards this artwork. And so if there were more groups like yours in the world, the likelihood of someone sitting on top of a 200-year-old masterpiece, I think, would be dramatically reduced. But anyway, before I continue on my soapbox lecture here, let's get into Caravaggio. We have much to talk about today, about one of my favorite artists in absolute. And you see that the title here, Caravaggio, the cursed painter. It doesn't translate perfectly. In the Italian, it's much more dramatic. It's the pittore maledetto. It's almost the damned painter, almost as if he was marked from birth to have this sort of black cloud hovering above his head. But before that black cloud could bring his life to an end, fortunately for us, Caravaggio produced some of the most spectacular works of art in history. Here, a posthumous portrait of the artist whose real name was Michelangelo Merisi. So his real name was Michelangelo Merisi, and he came from a town in northern Italy called Caravaggio. In fact, in this map, you can actually see where Caravaggio is located, essentially between Milan and Bergamo. And when Caravaggio was born in the town of Caravaggio in 1571, technically it was part of Venetian territory. And I want you to remember this because it's going to be important regarding Caravaggio's painting style, that his first teacher was an artist named Simone Peterzano, who was allegedly Titian, as in the great master from Venice, Titian's last student. So there's a direct connection between Caravaggio's painting and what happens in Venice during the Renaissance. Now, in 1592, he's about 21 years old, Caravaggio leaves the town of Caravaggio and makes his way to Rome, because Rome was, of course, the sort of artistic epicenter of the world. And when Caravaggio got to Rome, what he found was a very dog-eat-dog artistic environment, because there was a ton of talent with whom he was competing. So we're told by his earliest biographers that Caravaggio got a rather rocky start, essentially doing what most other artists did to sort of solicit their artwork, and that was to walk around the Piazza Navona with their paintings tied together in a sort of sandwich board manner. In other words, your paintings were actually hanging off of your very person, and you would spend your days walking around the piazza, hoping that an important patron would notice your work and then commission a work from you. That's supposedly how Caravaggio got started in Rome. Well, in fact, it seems that the whole plan paid off, right? Because he was discovered by a very important patron who actually invited him, Caravaggio, the artist, the young unknown artist, to move into his home, which is just across the street from the Piazza Navona, called the Palazzo Madama. And you Romophiles may recognize this. Today, this is the seat of the National Italian Senate. But when it was built in the 16th century, this was actually the Medici Palace in Rome. And this patron who discovered Caravaggio was this man whose name was Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte, a very close ally of the Medici, and in fact resided inside of their home there by the Piazza Navona. And so Caravaggio had his big break. He's noticed by a very important and cultured patron, this Del Monte character, and supposedly moves into the upper floors of the Palazzo Madama, again in the very early years of his life. And it was there that Caravaggio produced his earliest known works, one of which is this one, okay, the Sick Bacchus, as it's referred to. Right? Now, it's generally believed that it was kind of a false start for poor Caravaggio because he was finally noticed by this important patron. And when he moved in, shortly thereafter, Caravaggio fell very sick. And to pass the time, instead of binge watching Netflix, Caravaggio decided to actually paint himself. The Sick Bacchus is a portrait of Caravaggio in his sickly state, hence this description of sick Bacchus, or in Italian, the Bacchino malato, generally believed to be Bacchus because of the dominant role here of the grapes. You see it on the table and the grapes in his hands. But if you look carefully, that vegetal crown that this figure wears is not a grape leaf crown. Those instead are ivy leaves. And in fact, in the ancient Greek world, poets were described as being pale in complexion because they spent all their time indoors writing poetry, and they were crowned with ivy. So this is kind of an intellectual pun that Caravaggio is actually depicting himself as a visual poet, or what we would define as a painter, right? This is essentially where this notion comes from. So not Bacchus in all likelihood, but instead as a sort of classically garbed poet. And the composition, again, you're looking at Caravaggio, we're also used to seeing his work, and he is one of the most popular artists on planet Earth. And I always maintain, I think I told you this last week, 2 weeks ago, when we were looking at the Borghese collection, that at any given moment, there's a Caravaggio exhibit going on somewhere, right? It's just, there's a constant demand for his artwork. So we're used to seeing it, we're desensitized. But consider that Caravaggio is painting at a time when most art still sort of looks like Michelangelo, those bright electric colors, those superhuman forms. Then along comes this figure who brings his composition right up into your face. It's a primo piano, it's a close-up, with this table that serves as the sort of foreground establishment. It gives us a sense of where we are and where he is, right? So this parapet that occupies the foreground, the figure who occupies the middle ground, and then really no background at all. The sort of artificial, almost photographer studio background that he's thrown in. If you look very carefully, you can see the right leg of the figure and the left leg as well. And this type of composition was one that he actually learned from Venetian artists. This is one of my favorite paintings in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, Giovanni Bellini's Madonna and Child. And again, you can see essentially the same thing with this incredibly beautiful Virgin Mary, this rather odd-looking Christ child holding a quince in his right hand, this drape of honor. And I want you to remember this red drape, because this is something that comes back in Caravaggio's artwork later on. But this cloth or drape of honor has been drawn back to expose the sort of photographer studio environment that we're in. It's just a regular townscape back there. And so it's almost unveiling the mystery that this is just a woman dressed as the Virgin Mary, because that cloth is drawn back. But there's that same parapet that you see right in the foreground, right, to sort of establish this relationship between the viewer and the work of art. And of course, Bellini's signature as well. So a very strong influence of Venetian art in Caravaggio's work, particularly his early work. All right. Now, I should mention that this first patron of his, Del Monte, was notorious for being a playboy earlier in his life, and then a pedophile later in his life. In fact, much has been discussed of the sort of homoerotic trend in Caravaggio's early work, which some ascribe to Caravaggio's own sexual tastes, others instead saying, of course, it was the taste of his patron, Del Monte. Regardless, you do see this kind of new idea of homoeroticism in his artwork, particularly in this painting of the boy with the basket of fruit. And we actually know who the boy was. This is Caravaggio's amorous relationship early in his sojourn in Rome. His name was Mario Miniti. And we see him posing over and over again for Caravaggio. Because one of the other novelties of Caravaggio's painting style was that he would paint from live models. Whatever you see in a Caravaggio painting, you have to imagine posing or modeling for him in real life in his studio. Props included. This is something that Caravaggio did very often, and people who've been to his studio actually described what was there: swan wings, various baskets, different buckets of rotting fruit. And so suddenly a subject in art, and I want you to again realize how this just comes out of left field, is this solicitous looking young boy with this blouse falling over his right shoulder, these pouty, long, full lips looking out at us, and holding this extraordinarily vivid basket of fruit. All right, now, where does this fit into normal Renaissance or Baroque iconography? Where does the boy with the basket of fruit fit into biblical or mythological or allegorical stories? It does not. So it's a whole new genre of art. And when you have an artist who has this ability to reproduce reality almost photorealistically. It leads, there's a lot of spin-off that's going to come from Caravaggio, one of which is that he may have advertently or inadvertently created a new genre called still life painting. And the name for still life painting in Italian is natura morta, or dead nature. But this is not dead nature. This is living over ripe nature, the splitting fig, the splitting pomegranate, the rotting leaves that you see as well. And that's what I love most about Caravaggio, is that for him, perfection is imperfection. He's not going to use that waxed perfect fruit. He's going to show you the real fruit with the wormholes, because that is how things exist in reality. And again, this use of this rather neutral background, right? His medium, preferred medium, was oil on canvas. No preparatory drawings, no traces of cartoon transfer. He just went right onto the canvas. And a very common feature of his artwork was, in fact, to essentially, I think I mentioned this in that last lecture, he would just, if he did change his mind, paint over, almost photoshopping over, and then paint on top as well. And so most monographs on Caravaggio will, in fact, include photographs of x-rays of his paintings so that we can see the various pentimenti. Well, this composition, again, of the basket occupying the foreground, the figure occupying the middle ground, and then that sort of neutral background, is one that he also got from Venetian painting. Here, Giorgione's famous La Vecchia, which also doesn't fit into any iconographical box. There's that dividing parapet. Here's this figure who one would imagine is a portrait, but instead is not a portrait, because her dress tells us that she comes from a social class that would not have permitted her to have been able to hire Giorgione, but instead an allegorical image as she holds the scroll with the words "with time" on it instead. These are works that Caravaggio would have been familiar with, and that he essentially took with him in his sort of mental or aesthetic cachet to Rome, and then revolutionized painting while he was there. Right? Or this painting, right? One of his most celebrated, and the one that I used for my title slide. There is Mario again. And that's really, when you start to become familiar with Caravaggio, you start to become almost emotionally attached to his models, because you see them over and over again posing in various roles and various personages as well. And here Mario is now dressed up as Bacchus. And so you see they've just thrown the bed sheet over him. They've taken an old mattress and folded it in half and thrown the drape over to make it look like a Greek triclinia. And the interesting thing is that the sheet has come undone. But Caravaggio does not Photoshop over. He doesn't hide, but instead wants us to know that this is a mise en scène, that this is just us pretending to be, Bacchus here posing on his triclinia. And you can see that the model is actually drinking to pass the time. Look at the flush in his cheeks, in his hands. My favorite detail, of course, is the dirty fingernails of Bacchus, right? Showing us that this is a street thug posing as a Roman god. The ripe or overripe fruit, I should say, down here. Again, this homoerotic thread as he fingers that bow there. And if he pulls it open, of course, the whole costume comes undone, which would have played to the taste, perhaps, of Caravaggio's patron at the time. And then again, just testimony to Caravaggio's virtuosity is the carafe. Now, you can tell that Bacchus has just topped up the wine glass because the level of the wine is not horizontal, and there are bubbles all along the edge. And you can literally get a sense of the liquid moving inside. There was no other artist at this time who was capable, again, of reproducing what he saw with such verisimilitude, with just fidelity. And it really just changed the way painting would look at the time. But consider that up to this point, most of Caravaggio's commissions have been relatively small and private commissions. Like, for instance, his musicians. This is also in the United States. This is in the Metropolitan Museum, where, again, you can recognize there's Mario, same guy who posed as Bacchus and who posed as the boy with the basket of fruit. Here's a young Caravaggio. That's him in the back. That's a self-portrait. And this composition, which, again, serves no real kind of moral objective. It's just the young man with another young man who's kind of scantily clad, holding a Renaissance madrigal, a love madrigal in his hands. Cupid here in the back, a very beautiful Cupid with his wings his quiver, and arrows as he adjusts the grapes, and then Caravaggio kind of looking longfully. Remember that position of Caravaggio in the back of the painting looking towards us, because we're going to see it again in just one moment. It's not the most balanced or harmonious of compositions, but its general singularity, if you will, or uniqueness in terms of composition is one that's worth mentioning. But again, another relatively small private commission, as was this one. Right? And I know many of you are familiar with Caravaggio's famous Medusa shield. Right? This is a painting on a convex wooden ceremonial shield. This is not a shield that you would use in battle, but one instead that would be used in parades. And Caravaggio here using himself, right, as the face of Medusa, a self-portrait. And not just Medusa, but Medusa at the moment that her head has been severed from her body. And this is something else that we're going to see now more and more recurrently in Caravaggio's art, and that was his exaltation of violence. Caravaggio was a clinical sociopath. There's very little to be said about that. And most of what we know about this artist, we actually know from his criminal records. He was constantly in trouble with the law for all sorts of reasons. And he is perhaps the first artist where we get a true blurring of the lines between art imitating life and life imitating art, in the sense of, do we think that Caravaggio was such a violent sociopath because his artwork becomes increasingly more violent as we go along? Or is his artwork violent because he actually was violent as well? And so you're seeing, and it's probably a bit of both, to be perfectly honest, but he does have this kind of Quentin Tarantino, almost pulp sense of violence in his artwork, where it's almost so over the top that it almost loses its sense, if you will, of reality. And you actually see that here. Yeah, and when I'm in the Uffizi Gallery and we've gone through the top floor and you've looked at all those beautifully compositioned Raphaels and Michelangelos and Leonardos, and we're all feeling bubbly, and then you walk into the Caravaggio room and bam, this thing is staring you right back in the face. It is nothing less. Caravaggio, is nothing less than a sledgehammer in the history of art at the turn of the 15th and 16th. And they did, or 16th, excuse me, 16th and 17th century. They just did not see this coming. Right? His first major contract was in fact for the paintings in the chapel that you have up on your screen, and also here behind me. In 1602, Caravaggio receives a contract from the family of an important cardinal whose name was Matteo Contarelli. Right? His real name was a French name, was Mathieu Contrel, but the Italians, of course, Italianized it. And his heirs hired Caravaggio to actually come in and to paint the wall paintings for their family chapel in the French church of San Luigi dei Francesi. It's located exactly between Piazza Navona and the Pantheon in Rome. And this is really where Caravaggio made his splash. This is when he became the public figure, not just an artist who was sought after in this kind of inner circle of pederasts in early 17th century Rome, but now instead an artist who was sought after by all of the important patrons in the city for large monumental public commissions. And in fact, the first painting he executed is this one, the Martyrdom of Saint Matthew. It's in Saint Matthew the Evangelist. And the story goes that Matthew had actually set up an early Christian community in the North African country of Ethiopia. And while he was there, the king of Ethiopia was making advances on one of his followers, this young woman by the name of Iphigenia. Matthew stepped in to protect the young virgin from the less than virtuous advances of the king. And so the king, in anger, actually had St. Matthew assassinated. And the story goes that the assassination took place when Matthew was actually celebrating Mass, elevating the host, and an assassin came up from behind him and drove a sword into his back. So the description I gave you is the screenplay that Caravaggio is reading. You can read it for yourself in the Golden Legend. This is Caravaggio's cinematic interpretation of the event. And you've heard me use this analogy now for the last 6 weeks. Think about it from a cinematic perspective. You read the screenplay, you're reading the words, now you have to visualize it on the big screen, and Caravaggio's big screen is this canvas. So what you have is Matthew on the ground. He's already been struck because there's blood here on his white robe. It is very unclear exactly where we are. Some have suggested a bath complex because you can see these recesses. Others perhaps a baptismal font which would also then explain why some of these guys are wearing loincloths. But then if we consider that they're wearing loincloths, the question is, just where was the assassin hiding that sword when he walked in? I really don't see a convenient hiding place there on his person. And it looks as if Matthew is reaching up to defend himself, but in reality, he's reaching for the palm, which is extended towards him by the angel. And the palm, you may remember, is the symbol of martyrdom. Matthew's reaching for, he's willingly going towards his martyrdom here. And then this figure, which is a direct quotation from a Donatello relief sculpture that's in the baptistry in Siena. I'm not showing it to you because, again, I don't want to create confusion, but it's the true definition of horror, because horror makes us run, but horror also fascinates us. And so look how he's looking back to actually see how things go. And as all of this is taking place, look in the back of the painting. There's this character kind of leaning in, watching the scene attentively, who in the context of the narrative is the king who's ordered the assassination, but in reality is a self-portrait of Caravaggio. So again, to give you an idea of the type of personality we're talking about, he's the guy, you know, you hear that famous phrase from a certain movie saying, you know, he roots for the bad guys. Caravaggio actually depicts himself as the bad guy in the particular scene. And as much as Caravaggio said that he despised the lofty inspirational models of the Renaissance, particularly the works of Michelangelo and Raphael, that's what he said, right? His inspiration was on the streets. That's where he drew his models. That's where he drew his inspiration for his particular works. But if we were to cut off the lower half here of Raphael's Transfiguration, which I know many of you know very well, it's in the Vatican museums. It's one of my favorite paintings. Look how similar the martyrdom of St. Matthew is to the lower half of the Transfiguration, right? Particularly in the dramatic use of the chiaro scuro, that light dark contrast. Now, this is something that goes all the way back to Giotto at the beginning of the 14th century. Leonardo revolutionized chiaroscuro because he would use it for this modeling that made his paintings almost photorealistic. Raphael began to increase the intensity of that light and dark contrast in his paintings as well, and Caravaggio would make a living off of it. In fact, his paintings would become dominated by the darkness. He gave birth to a style in art called tenebrism. Tenebre is the Italian word for shadow, and tenebrism is the style of painting that was in fact introduced by Caravaggio, where essentially shadow becomes the kind of dominant element in the overall work. And it's curious that in fact there is such a strong connection back to the later works of Raphael. Right? Okay, here is the most famous of the paintings in the chapel, and some might say the most famous of all of Caravaggio's paintings, which is the Calling of St. Matthew. Now, you're the movie director, you have the screenplay, but there's not much to go on, because the Calling of St. Matthew essentially consists of two words: follow me. You read it, Jesus walks in, looks at Matthew, says, follow me, and he does, and presumably since he's there at the Last Supper and everything else, that Matthew became a follower of Jesus Christ. So how does Caravaggio, and now we're looking at his vision of this particular moment. We're outside of one of these grimy Roman palazzi, and again, I think many of you know Rome well, and I always say that Rome transforms. It's almost like a werewolf, right, at night, because all that dirt and grime and soot on those buildings kind of disappears into the darkness. And I think that's when Rome really becomes so mysterious. And we're sitting outside. Look at this window. Okay, but the curious thing, in fact, look at the virtual background behind. I'm going to go the other way. That window behind my head is the natural light source. So technically it's coming from the right-hand side of the painting, yet there's a window in the painting that's not producing any light of its own. If you've not made him out yet, here's Jesus Christ, who's got this kind of Michael Jordan swagger. There's just something so agile and graceful about this way this man walks, that right hand extended pointing towards Matthew, who's right here. But Matthew, well, I should mention there is some debate as to whether this is Matthew. I think it is. And you see Matthew's actually passing the buck, because he looks up, he sees Jesus pointing to him, and then he kind of passes it off to this guy saying, oh, you mean him? But this guy is so engrossed in counting money that he doesn't realize that the stranger has just walked into the room sort of a la Clint Eastwood in a Western or something like that, right? The other figure as well. And these are two contemporary, well, they're all dressed in contemporary garb from the early 17th century, but these figures, they were called spade. They were like wannabe gangsters, technically. These young men who would usually arm, dressed to the nines, and they're always looking for a good time. And a good time usually meant breaking the law. And supposedly they saw that potential in Caravaggio. So we're always kind of part of his little posse or retinue, whatever it is you want to call. And while Christ is calling Matthew, look at Igor over here. I just find Peter humorous. He comes kind of impishly stumbling into the scene, and his right hand echoes that of Jesus Christ in pointing over to the figure of St. Matthew as well. Just this incredibly simple, incredibly powerful. And again, imagine how the painting would have been received by a contemporary audience, which saw this biblical event taking place in their own contemporary world. Right? Now, originally, Caravaggio was not meant to paint the altarpiece. Again, if you look behind me, you'll see it right there. The altarpiece was meant to be a sculpture, but they liked Caravaggio's painting so much, they asked him to do the painting. And this is the second version, right? Matthew, whose symbol is the angel, because according to tradition, an angel actually dictated his gospel to him. And you see Matthew looking up attentively as the angel. If you know the Gospel of Matthew, it begins in a very tedious way with the generations of Jesus Christ. You know, so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. And you can see the angel starting off. Okay, so let's start with number one. Matthew, afraid he might miss a tick here and miss an entire generation. Well, consider I said that this is the second version, because the first version, which was destroyed in Berlin in 1945 during World War II, but fortunately we actually have black and white photographs of it, like the one you're looking at here, was thought to be a little too inappropriate. It made Matthew look so dumb, to put it bluntly, because the angel is physically moving his hand to write those words down, that the family said, look, we can't take this. We're going to need another version. And so Caravaggio, in fact, produced this one instead, which is the one that's in the chapel today. But the idea, because of his particular approach and interpretation of art, oftentimes there will be a conflict between what Caravaggio is painting and how he actually paints it. Remember, an artist who said he's gained his inspiration from the street, from his own sort of life, his own setting. But consider that he was an artist who spent a majority of his time between brothels and taverns. And so if his models and inspiration are coming from these two, lascivious places, I'm not sure how well that's going to bode, of course, when a majority of the art that he's producing is in fact Christian in subject matter. Okay, here we are in the Cerazzi Chapel. All right, now Cerazzi Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo in Rome. Right, and there's no more efficient way for me to illustrate the difference between Caravaggio and his peers than by showing you the altarpiece, which was painted by Annibale Carracci, and I think most of you recognize that name. He was another leading exponent of the Roman Baroque. Look at that painting with its bright, fanciful colors and these melodramatic gestures that you see. That was the typical result, if you will, or extension of what Michelangelo and Raphael had introduced a century before. Look at the paintings on the walls. I mean, they just could not be any different from what you see there. And this is Caravaggio painting exactly the same time as Carracci. And in fact, these dark backgrounds of Caravaggio unnerved many of his contemporaries because they thought that there might have been black magic at play. And Carracci actually once challenged Caravaggio to take one of his dark canvases, these tenebrist canvas, and to bring it out into sunlight, so that the sunlight would expose the demons that were dwelling in the back of these dark paintings. Again, to show you how his own contemporaries reacted to it. The crucifixion, of St. Peter is really one of the most moving works, I think, in the entire history of art. The model is the same as St. Matthew. I was saying before, you become almost emotionally attached to these guys, and he's perfect for Peter. Peter was the burly fisherman. So whoever this guy is probably some kind of manual laborer who probably lived next door to Caravaggio and say, would you mind, taking your shirt off, putting a pair of underwear on? And I imagine this was some kind of plank. I can't see Caravaggio going to the trouble of actually having a cross, but having three guys who are used to doing this kind of heavy lifting. Look at the guy squatting down here, right, with his hands on the shovel to sort of gain leverage. This other one embracing the bottom of the cross, and this other figure doing that kind of tricep exercise there as he lifts up as well. And all of it, again, in a dramatic primo piano. It's the close-up. where are they? Well, there's a rock. That's the only indication of setting that we have. And so the rock might also be a pun on Petrus. You are Peter, you are the rock upon which I build my church. But we'd spent 2 centuries working on linear perspective and atmospheric perspective and everything else, and all that's done away with now to create what the modern artist Frank Stella described as living theater. It's almost as if, you can imagine these figures getting, think of Bill Viola, if you're into, video art, that kind of, just imagine it. And then boom, he took that snapshot and he captures that moment when all of his models best expressed what the subject was actually supposed to be, right? Or his conversion of Saint Paul. He's on the road to Damascus, right, leading Christians to be persecuted, and he's thrown from his horse, and that voice cries out to Paul, or Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me, right? And from that moment on, he became one of the greatest advocates and voices of the religion that we call Christianity. Now, if you think about it, and I always reiterate this with my undergraduates, when you look at a painting, usually the main subject is smack dab in the center of the painting. And if that were true, in this case, the subject would be the belly of the horse. It's just such an unconventional composition where you have this extraordinarily foreshortened figure of Paul at the bottom. It almost is like he's invading our space. He's going to fall out of the painting. His helmet has come undone. It looks like he can't get up, and he's pinned to the ground. And what's pinning him to the ground is this divine light. Like again, that used that description before of the sledgehammer, and that's essentially the impression that I get, like he's been struck by one. Excuse me. The horse establishing that shallow foreground of the painting and creating with its own body the middle ground. There is some background back there in the groom that you see coming through, who's oblivious to what's going on, although the horse seems to be in on this particular miraculous event. Just a whole new way to interpret Christian subject matter in his works. Excuse me. Now, the first time he went to jail in 1602 was for assault. He actually assaulted a man who was supposedly making advances on Caravaggio's girlfriend, who was a prostitute, which may have created a kind of conflict of interest there. But anyway, second time he went to jail was for libel. He was publicly criticizing the work of a contemporary artist and later biographer of Caravaggio, whose name was Giovanni Baglioni. And the story goes that while Caravaggio was in jail, he was approached by the heirs of another wealthy Roman family named Cavalletti, and they asked him to do a painting for their chapel in the church of Sant'Agostino. Now, the scene in the movie that I always imagine, and I'm waiting for the good one to come out on Caravaggio, is Caravaggio sitting in his jail cell, singing songs, playing the harmonica or something like that. And the guard saying, oh, Caravaggio, you got a visitor. Caravaggio saying, nobody likes me, who's here? And these nobles coming in dressed to the nines and asking, hey, would you do a painting for us? Caravaggio says, yes. And they hand him the painting contract through the bars of his jail cell. We don't say that about many artists, by the way. It has to be Caravaggio. And so Caravaggio agrees that as soon as I get out of the can, I'll come and I'll actually pay or paint for your chapel in the church of Sant'Agostino. And that is where he paints the Madonna of Loreto. I show you the photo. It's not a great photograph, but I show it to you simply to show how the painting looks completely out of place in the context of the works around it. This is all that fluffy, colorful, artisty stuff, right? Whereas Caravaggio's is instead just this dark, ominous. We're in the back alley here of some Roman quartiere. Here we have the image. The Madonna of Loreto, if you don't know, by the way, Loreto is a town in Le Marche, the region of the Marches, where the Virgin Mary's house is supposedly located. I repeat, her house. Story goes that angels picked it up in Nazareth and for some unknown reason decided to put it in Loreto. And it's really one of the most important pilgrimage sites in the world still today. Millions of people go to pay homage to the home of the Virgin Mary. And so there are lots of representations of the Madonna of Loreto, usually in a domestic setting. None of them show the Virgin Mary, first of all, with the face of the prostitute that I mentioned a minute ago, which would have raised a couple of eyebrows, but then looking like an overworked housewife who's just scooped up her kid to come to the door for the who knows how many times that day, because 2 more pilgrims have come through to pay their respects in hopes of receiving a blessing from the Christ child. And my favorite part is, again, just that nonchalant stance. This is not something that Caravaggio invented. This is something he saw. in a woman leaning up against the doorway, and her stare, she's looking right through them. She's seen so many people that day. She has no idea. These faces are anonymous. They all start to look the same. And these dirty souls of these pilgrims, the leathery skin of the old woman that you see there, it's nothing less than astonishing in the context of the time period in which we're in. Look at the stucco that's come undone, revealing, of course, that we're in one of the lesser prestigious, let's say, quarters of Rome, which technically makes more sense than these lavish domestic interiors in which we normally see here. For another church shortly thereafter, Caravaggio receives the contract for his famous deposition, now also in the Vatican museums. And I know many of you have seen this in person. It is a stunning painting. Representing a very rare subject, by the way. The deposition, in order for a work of art to qualify as a deposition, it has to have a stone of unction, that ceremonial stone upon which Jesus's body was anointed before being entombed. And we have this rigor mortis figure of Christ. Look at that right finger stuck to the side of the tomb. And there's just a rawness to his body, the buttocks, and we're not seeing nudity per se, but there seems to be almost something inappropriate in how vivid a rendering of the anatomy this actually is. Then you have John's finger, which looks like it might accidentally slip into that wound, and that unnerving effect that you're feeling right now is the one that Caravaggio intended. This figure holding up Christ's legs, this unflatteringly old Virgin Mary looking down, Veronica with her veil, and Magdalene in that stereotypical emotional gesture that you see as well. And all of it, again, in this incredibly shallow foreground space, and the corner of the stone then echoed with the elbow coming right out. It's almost offensive to the viewer because, boom, it's not this is a painting that comes towards us as opposed to a space that recedes away from us. Completely different vision of composition of the time. Those of you who heard my talk on the Pleasure Palaces may remember this painting, which was commissioned by the papal grooms, the Palafrenieri, which was actually put on their altar in the chapel that they own in St. Peter's Basilica, and was then taken down 2 weeks later because it was considered indecorous. Indecorous because it really is the first monumental representation of the Virgin Mary's cleavage in the history of art. And again, he did not have to do this. That face might look familiar. It's the same face we saw a moment ago in the Madonna of Loreto. So it is this well-known courtesan who was modeling for Caravaggio, that figure of Christ who's being taught to stomp out evil, which was thought to be a bit of a kind of primal, violent, just not something you expect the Virgin Mary and Jesus Christ to be doing, that kind of scene. And so the notion technically that it wasn't the right way to actually paint these particular figures. And so Caravaggio, having his painting commissioned for St. Peter's, but ultimately not having it put in place. What happens to these paintings when they're rejected? Well, they're immediately bought up by other collectors. People weren't fools. In fact, they always said any publicity is good publicity, right? So the more they're talking about you, and the more rebellious he was, the more outlandish he was and inappropriate, the more demand his artwork actually became. And if you heard, and here's the figure of St. Anne that I mentioned as well, because it was a confraternity dedicated to the mother of the Virgin Mary, St. Anne, but Caravaggio has marginalized her to this kind of secondary role there in the shadow instead. The completely blackened background. And my favorite part about this is, and this is the poetry, you could get lost in the vulgarity of Caravaggio, how, that's inappropriate kind of attitude, but you can also then get lost in his sublime visual poetry, because there's a character in this painting who's not physically manifest in corporeal form, but is very much manifest nonetheless, and that is God. The way that light comes down. There's Dad. Dad has come, and Dad's also teaching Jesus how to stomp out that snake down below. It's absolutely beautiful and incredibly complex in contrast to the rest of the actual painting. Many of you heard me tell you that this is one of my favorite paintings by Caravaggio, his version of Saint Jerome, the translator of the Vulgate, the patron saint of scholars, being consumed by his work as he pulls the pages close to his eyes, and how close that hand comes to the skull, which of course is the memento mori, the reminder of death. This incredibly simple composition, which essentially is made up of just three colors, which are red, white, and black. Right? Now he's painting this in 1605. And by this point, he's reached the peak of success in Rome. He's being sought after by all the major patrons in the city. They all want works from Caravaggio. But it seems that Caravaggio was sort of a victim of his own personality, because the story goes that in May of 1606, he was also not only a drinker, but a gambler. And he lost a wager on a game that were being played. It's sort of the ancestor of tennis. He refused to pay the man to whom he owed money, whose name was Ruggiero Tommazzoni. And this man struck Caravaggio in anger. Caravaggio retaliated by pulling out a dagger and stabbing and killing him. Right? It happened on the Via della Scrofa. And so, when you're in Rome and you're in, let's say, the Church of San Luigi dei Francesi, which I mentioned is right there by Piazza Navona, that's Caravaggio's stomping ground. That's where it all happened. And you can actually see the place where this homicide took place. And Caravaggio's now wanted for murder, the punishment for which is death. Right? And so he flees Rome with the help of some of his important patrons, one family in particular named Colonna. He left Rome. This is May of 1606. He went to Naples. Now, supposedly, he's a fugitive on the run, but he's a celebrity fugitive. So when he got to Naples, he received some pretty important commissions, but I think he realized that it probably wasn't the proper cover for him to be working actively in Naples. So he left Naples and he goes all the way to Malta, you see in 1607. And in Malta, there seems to be this moment of conversion, because he's actually knighted, a knight of Malta, which is one of the greatest honors of the time. The Knights of Malta were like the, Christian special forces or something like that. And so it seems that he cleaned up his act, because he's now become noble. He's a lord. He's a knight, technically, as well. And perhaps his payment, if you will. In other words, you give me the title of knight, I give you one of the most extraordinary paintings in the history of art, which is the beheading of St. John the Baptist. This is still in Malta. I've seen it once in person because it was in Florence, where it was restored years back. It's big. It's 17 feet by 12 feet. And what you see is this image where John, has technically been executed, right, through beheading. You see the sword there, but his executioner realizes he hasn't gone all the way through. And so in a very familiar gesture, reaches behind his back and he pulls out the filleting knife, and he's about to cut off the room. I know this is gross, but that's the whole point. That's what Caravaggio wanted it to be, with these figures in their contemporary dress, the despair of this woman, the other. This looks like a scene that Caravaggio saw, but just then transformed into the execution of John the Baptist. And what kind of artist are we talking about? Well, not only did he root for the bad guys, he's also the kind of artist who actually signed his paintings in the blood of the deceased John the Baptist. You see here? Michelangelo. Remember, his name was Michelangelo Merisi. And so he actually, with his finger, writes out his name in the blood spilling from the neck of John the Baptist. This is an artist the likes of which we had not seen before, and seldom would we see again. All right. Now, many of you have heard this, but while he was in Malta, things went sour. He actually assaulted, we're told anyway, he assaulted one of his superiors and was arrested. Right now, today there's some debate as to whether this happened, but he was arrested. He was put in jail. He was freed. He went back to Sicily. In fact, let me go back to that map just to clarify this for you. Okay, he goes back to Sicily. So he's in Siracusa. Then he goes to Messina. Then he goes to Palermo. And while he's there, he hears that the new pope, who we talked about in the past lecture, who was Pope Paul V Borghese, was willing to pardon Caravaggio in exchange for a few paintings. Okay, one of those paintings is the one that today is in the Borghese gallery, and that is David with the head of Goliath. And this was Caravaggio's act of contrition. His message to the Pope. This is the same face we saw earlier in the Sic Bacchus painting, where essentially saying this is, obviously it doesn't correspond to his age. This is Caravaggio at the age at which he painted this. In 1607, he would have been 36 years old when he painted it. And so the message he's delivering to the Pope is, look, I've cut off that rowdy, violent, reckless head of mine, and I'm offering it up to you in exchange for the pardon and the forgiveness that you've actually given me. And he does that in a true, Caravaggio style here, where we see David stepping out of this dark background with this head in offering, right? But it's almost as if he can just toss the head out of the painting at us. Okay, and again, true Caravaggio, look at the eyeballs that are not focusing on the same point, the bruise left by the stone, the mouth that's locked open by its own weight, and the blood gushing from the truncated neck that has just been severed. Right? Well, how does it all end? And, you know, again, the problem is you're not sure whether you love Caravaggio because of his biography or because of his art or because of both. Let me go back to that map one more time. All right. He's in Palermo. He hears the Pope's willing to give him a break. And so he sets sail for Naples. But he's in Naples in 1609. From what we understand, he gets into a real serious brawl where he's seriously disfigured. Okay. But at this point, he's told, look, you can come back to Rome. It's all clear. He gets on a boat. The boat should have docked. You see the Polo Laziale here, right? Actually, a little bit sooner in Civitavecchia, which is where the boats actually dock. Instead, for some reason, this boat just kept going all the way up to Porto Ercole. This is southwestern Tuscany. His biographer says that he got off the boat. He was with his paintings. There was a case of mistaken identity, and he was arrested by mistake. Okay. While he was trying to clear up this bureaucratic error, the boat that he was sailing on with the paintings actually then left port and made its way to Rome. That's why the painting is actually in the Borghese collection. Caravaggio, we're told, instead decided to try to chase the boat down on foot. It's July, early July. It's hot in Italy at that time. And after a couple of weeks of frantically trying to chase the boat down, he died, according to his biographer, without the aid of God or of man. These are his exact words. Without the aid of God or of man, he died as badly as he had lived. Those are his exact words. That essentially it was sunstroke. That Caravaggio's death was nearly vampiric. That he was out there in the bright sun and like the Wicked Witch of the West kind of melted away. Well, that was the version that was accepted for quite some time. Then more recently, there have been other proposals. One, that he was actually assassinated and that his imprisonment back in Malta was not because of an assault, but because he had deflowered the young boyfriend of the Grand Guardian of the Knights of Malta, who never forgave Caravaggio. And so there was this sort of international hit or bounty put on his head. And so he was killed, thrown off the boat, and that was the end of it. Another one is that the accident that happened in Naples caught up with him when he got there, and so he died. Another is that he may have had syphilis. Another is that he had lead poisoning, and that's why not only was he crazy, but eventually led to fatal intoxication. It's all this mystery. And some of you may remember that back in 2010 was the 400th anniversary of Caravaggio's death. And we didn't know where he was. I mean, there was no Caravaggio, just stories. We do know the boat ended up in Porto Ercole, but we don't know where he was. And so National Geographic, if I remember, began this investigation. And they, in Porto Ercole, find the bones of a man who would have been 39. That's how old Caravaggio was when he died. And they then went back to Caravaggio and they did DNA testing of the people there, and they found compatibility in the genetic sequence. So supposedly this person they found came from Caravaggio. They also found heavy doses of lead, I imagine, in what they were examining at the time. And so they pretty much said that, look, we're fairly certain that we found the bones of Michelangelo Merisi, known as Caravaggio. To be perfectly honest, I have serious doubts about that, but it was a great story nonetheless looking for it. We don't know really how Caravaggio died. And I like that. I like the fact that we don't know how he died, because I think it's the perfect way for him to leave in mystery. And it's sort of dark circumstances, as dark as the backgrounds in the paintings that actually made him so famous. Okay. And with that, if you have any, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Right. We have a number of questions, so we'll jump right in. One of the questions that's come up from a couple people is, you know, how does Caravaggio influence the people who follow him, right? Because there's this major break with Raphael and sort of precursors. How is he seen by contemporary artists? How does his style influence the people who are painting around the same time and in the decades after?
Yeah. I mean, you could pretty much judge the importance of an artist based on how many people then imitate his style. And I think most of you know that the Caravaggisti, or those painters who paint in the style of Caravaggio, were many, many, many. In fact, the most celebrated is the female artist by the name of Artemisia Gentileschi. Her father, Orazio Gentileschi, was another. Consider Rubens. Rembrandt himself was influenced by Caravaggio. It was a tremendous effect on European art. It wasn't just what was happening in Rome or in Italy, but on European art in general, and some of the most influential of the artists in Europe. But I do also want to mention this, that this style kind of fell out of favor for a while. Right? I mean, we see the influence pretty much up until, let's say, the middle of the 18th century, when French academic painting became the norm. And there's no room for Caravaggio in that, because they went back to, Raphael's kind of balanced compositions. And Caravaggio was not a significant artist again, meaning he wasn't perceived as a significant artist until the beginning of the 20th century. It was Longhi and Sir Dennis Mahone, the British man, who pretty much revived him and said, look, we got to look at Caravaggio because this guy is tremendously important. And in fact, they kind of resurrected that Bacchus that I showed you from the Uffizi, that had been sitting in the warehouse for centuries. And they rediscovered it in the 1920s. I mean, imagine seeing a painting as beautiful as that, and it was just left in storage, and someone said, I think that's a pretty important painting. And then suddenly it was coincide exactly with the moment that, there was this rediscovery of Caravaggio. So consider that I'm talking about him like he's the Elvis Presley of painting, but he did fall into obscurity for a couple of centuries.
Yeah. Did he have any well-known students during his lifetime?
I mean, he had his sort of hanger-oners. I guess Orazio Gentileschi would be the most famous. There was Checco di Caravaggio, none of whom necessarily reached the same level as Caravaggio, but there were quite a few artists who did imitate his style. And some of them so well that we sometimes have just difficulty distinguishing between the hand of the master and that of the followers. But he didn't apprentice. Okay, this is the other thing as well. He didn't have time to sit there and hold somebody's paintbrush and teach them how to paint. These would be artists who were in Caravaggio's sort of circle, were in his studio when he was painting, and by simple observation would begin to imitate Caravaggio's style. He didn't teach, is my point.
Right. Do we know, we've had a couple people note that same connection with Rembrandt and Rubens and some of the other Dutch painters. Would Caravaggio have been aware of some of the Dutch still life paintings that were happening? Were they before, after, during?
Yeah, I mean, the Dutch are already working with still life. And again, inevitably people imagine that Caravaggio would have had to go to Flanders or Holland, but that's not true, because there were so many reproductions of works of art that were circulating at the time that he could have seen an engraving. He could have seen literally a physical reproduction of it as well. So, and again, Rome was the epicenter for artistic production at that time. And those artists all came in pilgrimage to Rome to see the artwork. And that means that not only were they exposed to what was in Rome, but the Romans were exposed to what was happening up there as well.
Question about process. So he's painting from real life models. How would that process have worked? How long would people have to sit still or hold a position to, make it work?
That's the other, issue. There's what his biographer said, that the Mario, the guy who does The Boy with the Basket of Fruit, that at one point Caravaggio actually chained him to the thing that he was, because he didn't want him to leave. He couldn't let him. He was literally imprisoned by Caravaggio. I remember reading, and I actually believe there's a lot of credence to this, that Caravaggio had to develop some kind of shorthand method for capturing his models. And so, well, one of the things, again, this is not universally accepted, but he may have painted using a mirror, so that if I hold the mirror up, it automatically creates my field, right? And I'm limiting myself to what I see in the mirror for my painting. And that what Caravaggio would do, because it's oil, he would prime it in black paint and then probably just take the pointy end of the brush and then make physical incision marks, like Michelangelo did when he painted the Sistine ceiling in the wet plaster, but that he would actually mark off the contour of a head, the contour of an eye, so that he had physical markings on the canvas. And then if he needed to, God, I just can't remember that, maybe, again, most of these models are people from his inner social circle. So I can't imagine it would have been that difficult to get them back in the studio. Look, so just give me 15 minutes dressed as, Bacchus again. And that's, I promise, the last time I'll have you do it. So I think that might be why the familiarity with the models was also convenient for him. because he
Right.
could get them back in the studio should he need them.
Right. With the painting of Bacchus, the carafe in the lower left-hand corner, there's sort of a light reflection that we see on the curve of the glass. One of our folks has a question about, can we see anything in that reflection? Is there
I believe it's a self-portrait of Caravaggio. And in fact, now that you pointed out, it dawned on me again. I remember reading that. Let's see. I'll go back. We don't have that many paintings to go through. And by the way, there aren't that many paintings in the world by Caravaggio. I think I may have told you this before, but I used to say 44. Yeah, if I remember correctly, I think it's down on the bulbous part of it, right? If I remember correctly, that if you look close enough with a magnifying glass, you can actually see Caravaggio's own face reflected on the surface of the carafe. You know, I can't make it out, to be perfectly honest, where I am right now, but I've seen images of it when they blow up the whole thing and you can actually see the artist there reflected in the surface. Thanks for pointing that out, by the way.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is pretty cool. It's one of those things. And yeah, I'm cynical. I'm one of those guys who never believes the hype. It's just urban legend. But your eyes can't deceive you. When you see the close-up of it, it's there. So there's no way for me to refute that.
Yeah, yeah. What kind of evidence do we have that's contemporary with Caravaggio that lets us put together his life? So obviously prison records and, sort of criminal, accusations and judicial findings, but what other sort of things do we have?
His two earliest biographies, the Giovanni Baglioni biography, which is biased, because when he was arrested for libel, the person that he was libeling was in fact the author of this biography. Not only was Caravaggio running around saying that Baglioni's paintings were awful, but they were actually putting stuff in print. They were literally printing things saying Baglioni's just a terrible painter. So he was sued by Baglioni. That curiously is Baglioni, whether or not he was intentionally then trying to slander Caravaggio posthumously, we don't know. And then there's Pietro Bellori, Bellori, who also writes a biography that's fairly, no, that's not really close, but it's not that distant a biography of Caravaggio. And then, letters, contracts, things like that we find in the archives that we can sort of piece together. But again, when you hear that much debate concerning an artist, that means that, we have some of the facts, but we're still missing quite a bit. And that's kind of the big issue. So,
Right.
Some big lacunae, let's put it this way, in his biography.
Right. Well, we've got time for one more question, and I'm going to take the liberty of combining a couple, which is basically, can you talk a little bit about the placement of some of these paintings in chapels and the way that natural light and windows and lighting in the paintings kind of work together?
And actually, that's a great question. And the answer is that they don't. And that's really, again, I gave a lecture on this, Caravaggio and the modern artist Frank Stella. And that was Stella's comment about Caravaggio being essentially the first modern artist, because, where is it? Let me show you the Martyrdom of St. Matthew. This painting doesn't need to be in this chapel behind me. Okay, this painting could be hanging in your living room. It could be hanging in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, it could be hanging in the Getty Center in Los Angeles. The impact is the same. Whereas most are, I just finished my summer camp. I do a youth summer camp. And we were talking about the convent of San Marco in Florence. And the whole point of that lecture with, their 8, 9, 10-year-old kids is to see art in situ, see it in its original location, learn about how important the context of a work of art is. That Annunciation by Fra Angelico's at the top of the stairs, that image of St. Aquinas shushing people as going to the church. Caravaggio doesn't have to be. I mean, this could be anywhere. And this painting, it's the same. And that's the extraordinary thing about it, where all of a sudden it becomes this kind of mobile object that's by no means bound to its architectural setting. That's a pretty extraordinary thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I think that's about all the time we have for today. So thank you so much, as always, Rocky, for a fantastic
Thank all of
lecture.
You. Grazie, everyone. Thanks for joining. And we'll see you next week for
Next
our
week.
last lecture and our last supper lecture. So it's
That's it.
Okay.
That's it. It's the big.
One
the big
of you
final
will betray
one.
me. One of you will betray me, and I know it's you, Katie. I've been watching.
Probably. It's a pretty good guess. No, that's right. So next week is our last lecture in this series, as always, if you want to see any of the previous lectures, you can always check them out online at californiapatrons.org/lecture series. They're also up on our YouTube channel, and you can always find them there as well. So it just remains for me to thank the California and Northwest chapters for their sponsorship of this series. And of course, all of you for joining us live today on Zoom, on Facebook, on all different devices. We really appreciate you being with us for this series. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Ciao tutti.